Hi guys, in this video I'm going to show you our best race setup for every track in F1 2020. This will be a long video, so I'll include timestamps in the description below so you can jump to the track you're interested in. All of these setups have been designed for longer 50% or 100% races, both for career mode and league racing, and all of these setups offer dry weather. If these setups help you out, please drop this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more sim racing content. Albert Park is a tricky and fast circuit with a lot of high-speed corners. This means you'll need a stable rear end which allows you to plant the throttle on corner exit. For this reason, we will run a higher downforce rear wing and lower the aero on the front so we don't compromise our straight line speed too heavily. Set these to 5 and 7. This is higher than in F1 2019, but we've found that the fastest setups in F1 2020 require ever so slightly more downforce in this year's game. We have left our diff settings slightly lower than average to preserve tyre life. As you'll see, we've opted for an aggressive camber and toe setup, so we are compromising our diff settings to account for this. Go for 60% and 65% here. Moving on to the suspension geometry, we've run a reasonably aggressive camber setup at -2.6 and -1.1. Tyre wear isn't overly a massive problem around Melbourne, so we can run reasonably aggressive. We've set the toe to 0.06 and 0.23. Again, reasonably aggressive, but the car can handle it around here. F1 2020 really rewards softer, more drivable setups, and Australia is no different. We've gone for 3.3 for the suspension, 6.9 for the anti-roll bars, and 4.4 for the ride height. The soft suspension, combined with the stiffer anti-roll bars, make for a car which can attack the curbs, yet remain stable under sharp direction changes. The brake pressure is set high at 95%. In F1 2020, brake pressures can be set higher across the board. There are a few heavy braking zones around Albert Park, so the high brake pressure is a must. You should run your brake bias at around 55 to 56% for a good combination of braking power and balance. The tyre pressures are a little lower than default, and we're running offset tyre pressures on the front to account for more wear on our left front tyre. Set these to 22.6, 22.2, 20.3 and 20.3. Bahrain is a very power dependent track with a few long straights and heavy acceleration zones. So to get the most out of your car around here, you'll need a well balanced setup with a good rear biased aero setup. We have set up the wings to 3 at the front and 7 at the rear. This rear value follows the trend of higher downforce levels in F1 2020 compared to last year's game, and it should give you enough rear downforce to truly power out of the corners and onto the long straights. In F1 2020, running your rear wing higher doesn't affect your drag too much because of the DRS system, so around power hungry tracks which require a lot of rear traction, you can set your rear wing higher than you normally would. We'd recommend running your diff low around Bahrain. There are a lot of slow acceleration zones, and you can easily spin up your wheels on corner exit. So set your on throttle diff to 55 and off throttle to 65. Tyre wear isn't too bad here, especially since becoming an evening race with cooler track temperatures. So you can run the suspension geometry reasonably aggressive at -2.7 and -1.2. The toe we run at 0.07 and 0.26. This lower toe value helps with straight line speed. You'll find yourself attacking the curves a lot around Bahrain, so you'll want a soft suspension setup. So go for a 3.3 suspension to achieve this. To compensate for the soft suspension setup, you should look to run stiffer anti-roll bars for added responsiveness. Go for 7 and 8, and finally a 3.4 ride height. As with most F1 2020 setups, you should set your brake pressure high at around 90%. Just be careful braking into turns 9 and 10, so it's extremely easy to lock your front tyres. Run the brake bias at around 54 to 55% for good balance under braking. Finally, run the tyre pressures at 23.4 at the front and 21.1 at the rear. The slightly lower tyre pressure at the rear will help with traction. Hanoi can be a tricky circuit to learn, with a few frustratingly technical corners. However, what is apparent is that you need a very stable and reasonably low drag car setup. Hanoi is also limited by tyre wear, and easily a 2-stop race at 50% race distance. The setup below helped us perform a 1-stop strategy during a 50% race in our career mode, helping us get a great result around this brand new track. Let's start by setting up your aero with 3-7 wings. You need to ensure your setup is fairly low drag, and we achieve this with a low downforce front wing. Due to the high tyre wear, you should certainly look to run a very conservative transmission setup. We've gone for 55 and 60% here. This will help with traction onto the long straights as well as extending your tyre life. We've set up our camber to allow us maximum speed through the twisty final sector. There was a lot of time to be found in this last sector, so a high camber setup is key. We've reduced the toe setup to be efficient along the long straights, maximising our straight line speed. Our suspension is a combination of a softer front end and stiffer, more responsive rear end. The soft front will allow you to attack the curbs that you need to around Hanoi, while the stiffer rear and stiff anti-roll bars ensure your car is responsive as it needs to be through the twisty sectors. Finally, the ride height is most efficient when set to 3.5. Braking is crucial around Hanoi, with some extremely heavy braking zones. Set your brake pressure high at 95% and the brake bias at around 54%. This will give the best combination of braking power and stability. And finally, to round out our setup and to ensure that we have the best tyre life possible, go with extremely low tyre pressures. Go 21.8 at the front and 19.9 in the rear. China is a primarily high-speed track, which is very fun to drive. It's actually one of our favourite tracks on the calendar. There are a lot of long, medium to high-speed corners which require a sticky rear end. For this reason, we run a higher downforce rear wing and lower aero on the front at 3 and 6. This will help your car grip through corners and minimise drag on the long straights. Running a higher rear wing won't compromise your straight line speed too much due to the DRS system, and we found that the front wing seems to have much more of an impact on drag than the rear in this year's game. We want the on-throttle diff near its lowest setting at around 60% to maximise traction, and the off-throttle diff at 65%. Having a more open diff will benefit traction throughout your whole lap and increase consistency throughout a long race. We've set up our suspension geometry to primarily give us more speed through the slower to medium speed corners. The camber is set to -2.7 and -1.2. This will provide a more responsive car, allowing you to carry more speed through the first and second sectors. We have left the toe reasonably balanced at 0.08 and 0.32. This gives the best trade-off of speed down the straights and balance throughout the lap. We try to use our suspension setup to combat some of the excess tyre wear that you will experience on your front left tyre. Set the suspension soft at 2 and 6. This will also allow you to attack the curves throughout the middle of the lap. Having a stiffer rear end will help with straight line speed and allow the car to stay responsive. The anti-roll bars are set to 5 and 8, with the ride height set to 2 and 3. This will help keep rigidity in the rear of the car and increase your potential top speed. Because of the heavy braking zones, we're running a high brake pressure at 95%, and we keep the brake bias reasonably balanced at around 54%. Finally, we look to keep the tyre pressures from overheating by running slightly lower pressures all around. If you find yourself really struggling with front left tyre wear or excess heat, you can lower your front left pressure down a click or two. Zandvoort features some extremely quick sectors with an almost roller coaster style feel to the track. Looking at the aero setup, Zandvoort can be taken at high speed, although there are a fair few corners which require a very sticky car. We found that having a higher aero setup works better than the low drag alternative. Set your wings to 6 and 9. This gives enough front and rear downforce through the extremely fast undulating corners. Set your transmission to 50% and 58%. This allows your car to be very drivable out of the slow corners, and the low off-throttle diff keeps your car responsive and on its toes. With the suspension geometry, Zandvoort is another track which benefits from higher camber and low toe. This combination will help your car through the longer corners while staying responsive. Go for -2.6, -1.1, 0.06 and 0.26. Zandvoort is one of the bumpiest tracks on the calendar, with many elevation changes. This means you'll want an extremely soft suspension, with 1 at the front and 3 at the rear. You'll also be riding over curbs both on corner entry and exit, so the soft suspension will help you here. We try to keep the anti-roll bars a little stiffer than the suspension, while not being too stiff at 6 and 7, and the ride height should be set to around 2 and 4. Overall, this suspension setup will allow you to really attack this track without your car being too skittish. As for the brakes, we're running a combination of high brake pressure and a slightly rearward brake bias. The brake bias at 52% will help combat the higher brake pressure, and you shouldn't experience any wheel lock-ups. We use the tyre pressures to soften the car a little bit more, and we found that 21.8 at the front and 19.5 at the rear works best. Your front left tyre takes the most punishment around here, so you can lower that by 1 click if you run into any heat issues. But to be honest, you really shouldn't encounter any tyre issues with this low pressure setup. Catalunya is comprised of fast straights and fast corners, mixed with a slow final sector. It really has a bit of everything, meaning creating a car setup is always a matter of compromise. To start with the aero, you typically want to run a low drag front wing with more rear downforce. This will allow you to plant your right foot on corner exit without the back end stepping out. Go for 4 at the front and 7 at the rear. Spain is a track that allows you to go much more aggressive on your diff setup. You can keep the on-throttle diff higher than a lot of tracks, as there aren't as many high traction zones around here. You can also keep the off-throttle diff higher. This will keep your car more stable through the longer corners. If you find the car not rotating quick enough through the final sector, try lowering your off-throttle diff a little. As with many tracks in F1 2020, you should look to keep the camber as high as possible and the toe as low as possible, without compromising your tyre wear too much. Go for -2.8, -1.2, 0.07 and 0.23. You'll want to set up your suspension to be very soft so you can attack the final sector, and you'll want to have very stiff anti-roll bars to keep the car flat and responsive through the fast sweeping corners. Finally, set the ride height to 2 and 3 for the best downforce and minimum drag. There aren't too many heavy braking zones around Spain, and certainly not nearly as many as other tracks on the calendar. This means we can run our brake pressure a little lower here to help manage our brakes and tyres. Keep the brake bias fairly balanced at 52%. As for tyre pressures, you'll want to run offset pressures at the front, ensuring your front left is lower than the right. This will help protect it, as this is the tyre that will take the most amount of pain around Spain. Lower the rears slightly to increase your traction and prevent wheel spin. You want to run extremely high downforce around Monaco, but stay away from maxing out completely. You will still require a bit of straight line speed to make sure you aren't vulnerable into Zandvoort and the Nouvelle chicane. Set your front aero to 8 and rear to 10. Keep your diff set up low, with the on-throttle diff set to 50 and off-throttle set to 60. This will help with traction, which you'll require a lot of around Monaco, and the low off-throttle diff will help your car rotate through the tighter corners. As for the suspension geometry, your main goal is to keep your car responsive while maintaining traction throughout the lap. Do this by running the popular combination of high camber and low toe. For the suspension, you will want an overall soft setup. Lower the front to 1 while keeping the rear at 4. This will allow you to tackle the bumps and curbs with ease while keeping some responsiveness at the rear. Set your anti-roll bars to 5 and 9. The softer front will again help with rotating your car through the slower corners, while the rear will help with responsiveness, especially through the fast swimming pool sector. Set your ride height to 2 and 5. This is about as low as you can get away with due to the bumpy surface. You should look to run lower brake pressures around Monaco, as there is a tendency to lock your front right tyre through a couple of corners. Run it at around 88% while keeping the brake bias neutral at 50%. Finally, keep your tyre pressures relatively balanced with slightly lower front left tyre pressures. Then lower your rear pressures to around 20.7 to give you better tyre life and traction. You'll want to scrape off as much aero as you possibly can and run 1 on your front wing. Keep your rear wing at 5, as you'll need the downforce out of the heavy traction zones. Having a rear wing angle of 5 shouldn't overly hurt your straight line speed due to the DRS zone along the long straight. Run your on-throttle diff at 50% to help with traction and your off-throttle diff at 55%. This will help you rotate the car through the slow middle sector and will offset any understeer you get from your low front wing. You'll want to keep your camber reasonably high while lowering your toe. The lower your toe, the faster your car will be, as your wheels will be pointing closer to dead straight. We'll find a little lower rear toe compared to the front will help minimise drag and keep life in your tyres. You'll be hitting curbs hard around Baku, and they're very high, so keep your suspension reasonably soft. Set the front to 2 and rear to 4. Similar to our Monaco setup, we'll set a slightly lower front anti-roll bar to help minimise any understeer, but overall, keep your anti-roll bars higher than at Monaco, as you'll be carrying more speed through corners throughout a lap of Baku. Go for 6 and 9. You'll want to run your car as low to the ground as possible to mitigate any excess drag, so go with 2 and 4 on your ride height. There are a few big stops around Baku, so run with 95% brake pressure while keeping your brake bias balanced at 51%. This balanced brake bias will help avoid lockups, which is so easy to do around here. Finally, we're keeping the front tyre pressures reasonably balanced for good responsiveness and going extremely low on the rear tyre pressures to aid traction. Go 23 and 23.4 at the front and 19.9 on both rears. Canada is a track where you really need a good rear end. You want your car sticking throughout the fast corners, so rear downforce is key. We like to run our aero at 2 and 6. If you find you aren't quite getting the front end grip you need, increase the front aero to 3. A 3-6 setup will still give you a good amount of straight line speed in a race. Because protecting your rear tyres is crucial here, run your on-throttle diff at 50% and your off-throttle diff at 55 to 60%. Having your off-throttle diff at 55% should help the front of the car turn in a little better. With your suspension geometry, you should look to run -2.8, -1.3, 0.07 and 0.2. You'll see this style of setup a lot, and that's because it simply works well. Having the lower rear toe also helps with your rear traction and straight line speed. Canada is a great example of a track where you're looking to run over the curbs to find extra lap time. Because of this, set your suspension to 2 and 3 and your anti-roll bars to 5 and 9. This combination will take out some of the rigidity from the front, allowing you to hit the curbs hard. Finally, set your ride height to 2 and 4. Canada requires a really balanced brake setup, so try to run your bias at around 50%. As for your brake pressure, we go for 95%, but you can run higher if you're feeling confident. Moving on to the tyre setup, you should look to protect your rear tyres with low pressures and run your front a little lower than normal as well for a little bit of extra softness over the curbs. You may also want to run slightly offset tyre pressures to protect your front left a little during the race. There are a few relatively long straights at Paul Ricard, but you will require enough downforce to be quick around the corners. Run 4 and 6 on your wings. If you're looking for a little more speed to overtake during a race, knock your front wing down to 3 after qualifying. As France doesn't have too many heavy traction zones, you can run slightly higher on your diff settings than a lot of tracks. Go for 65 and 75 here. We run our usual style of suspension geometry setup for France, as it's the best way to set up your car to be fast in a straight line. Go with -2.8 and -1.3 on the camber, and 0.08 and 0.29 on the toe. Due to the speed you'll be attacking corners around France, we want a suspension setup that isn't skittish and unstable and can handle being thrown around. For this reason, run your suspension soft at 2 and 4 and your anti-roll bars stiff at 8 and 9. As this track is extremely smooth and flat, we can run a low ride height at 1 and 3. There are a fair few big stops around France, so run your brake pressure high at around 92 to 95% and pair this with a brake bias of 52% to help prevent front lockups. The tyre pressure setup for France isn't entirely dependent on preserving your tyres, as France isn't a track which is overly hard on tyre wear. With that said, you'll want to keep your pressures fairly balanced at 23.4 and 23 for the fronts, and both rears at 21.1. Austria is extremely fast, and with that you'll want a planted rear end. Run your downforce at 2 and 5 or 3 and 5 if you find yourself understeering a little. We tend to go for 3 and 5 during quali and 2 and 5 for the race. You don't need too much downforce here, as Austria is such a high-speed track. At the end of the long straights are a few heavy braking zones, which lead into heavy traction zones. Because of this, run your on-throttle diff at 50% to avoid wheel spin. Your car should always remain stable around Austria, as the track isn't too demanding, so run your off-throttle diff at 60% for a pointier car. You should look to keep the camber reasonably balanced around Austria, so run with -2.9 and -1.4 here. To aid with traction and straight line speed, set your toe close to minimum. This will also help you manage any potential tyre wear issues you may run into during the race. As you would have seen from the real Austrian Grand Prix, the curbs around here are reasonably harsh, so ensure you set up your suspension to handle these. Go with a soft setup at 2 and 3, while keeping your anti-roll bar stiffer at 5 and 9. You can run your ride height pretty low at 2 and 4 around here. Next up is the brakes. As with a lot of our setups, run your brake pressure high at 95% and keep your brake bias close to 50%. This combo will give you possibly the best outright braking performance without too high of a risk of locking up. Finally, with the tyres, look to run a slightly offset setup to protect your left front tyre. Go for 23 and 22.6 at the front and run both rears at 20.7 to help with traction. We need just enough downforce to get the car turned in at high speed and grip through the corner and exit. Run with 3 and 6 wings here. As for the differential, running low on-throttle diff is always a good idea to aid with tyre life, and for that reason, we've set it to 55%. We've also set the off-throttle diff to 55% to help with turn-in through the slow first and last sectors. We've set up our geometry to -2.8 and -1.3 for the camber, and 0.07 and 0.26 for the toe. This combination gives us a good balance between pace, straight line speed and stability throughout the lap. You will be flinging your car around with quick direction changes throughout the lap of Silverstone, and for this reason we've gone with a slightly stiffer suspension setup than normal. When I say stiff, the suspension is still on the softer side, but stiffer than a lot of our other setups. Go for 3 and 4 on the suspension and 5 and 9 on the anti-roll bars. Then go for a ride height of 2 and 5. For the brakes, run with our usual setup of 95% pressure and 52% brake bias. This gives the best combination of stopping power and stability. Now, the tyres all need to be on the low side, because Silverstone is hard on tyre wear. Go for 21.8 and 21.4 at the front, and 19.9 and 19.5 at the rear. These pressures help protect your tyre as much as possible while prioritising your left side, which will take the most punishment. To be quick around Hungary, you will require a high downforce setup. This will hamper your straight line speed, but you should be able to have a solid pace throughout a race, giving you the edge when it comes to strategy. Go for 7 on the front wing and 10 on the rear. As for the differential, go 50% on throttle diff to ensure you minimise your wheel spin while exiting all of the slow corners, and there are a lot of those around here. Then set your off throttle diff to 60%. This will help with stability as you throw your car about. Moving on to the suspension geometry, set your camber just shy of maximum. This will give you a car which is more stable while giving you a little extra responsiveness compared to a complete max setup. Then set your toe to its minimum value. This will aid straight line speed and tyre wear. The suspension is where you can really dial in the characteristic that we want for Hungary. As usual, we will run a primarily soft setup and stiff anti-roll bars. However, setting the suspension to 1 and 6 allows the car to rotate more going into the slow corners, which is crucial around here. Go with stiffer anti-roll bars with 6 and 9 and a ride height of 3 and 5. Closing out our setup, we have gone with the common brake setup of 95% pressure and 50% bias for the best performance under braking, and then set our tyre pressures low at 21.8 for both fronts and the minimum of 19.5 at the rear. This will give you the best combination of traction and tyre durability. Both the first and last sector around Spa feature extremely long straights, and you will be a sitting duck if you don't prioritise a low downforce setup. So go with 2 and 5 on your wings. The low downforce front wing will maximise your straight line speed, while the average rear aero will give enough grip through the faster corners. For your differential setup, go 52% on throttle diff to give you great stability on corner exit, and set your off throttle diff to 60%. With the more open off throttle diff, you'll achieve better rotation on corner entry, helping get your front end turned in. We run our camber much more balanced for Spa at -2.9 and -1.4, as this will allow you to lean better on your tyres through the far sweeping corners. Then set your toe to 0.06 and 0.2 for the best straight line speed. As is the trend with almost all of our setups, we've gone for a soft suspension. A combination of 1 and 3 suspension and 5 and 9 anti-roll bars will allow you to ride the curves throughout the lap while giving your car enough rigidity throughout the long sweeping corners. Then set your ride height to 2 and 4. Set your brakes to 95% pressure and 52% brake bias. This will help slow the car down quickly without locking your wheels. And finally, our tyres. Spa isn't overly demanding on tyre wear, so we can run our pressures fairly balanced to try and extract some extra performance out of them. Go with 23.4 psi at the front and 20.7 on both rears. Monza rewards an extremely low downforce setup, with top speed being the most important factor around this Italian circuit. With that in mind, run your aero at 1 and 4. You can run a 1 and 3 setup around Monza, however you won't quite be able to carry as much speed through the fast corners. We find that 1 and 4 gives us the best trade-off of straight line speed and rear downforce. Monza typically has slower corners at the end of long straights, and with this, traction on corner exit is key. Because of this, you should look to run 50% on throttle diff to ensure you get the best corner exit without lighting up your rear tyres. Then set the off throttle diff to 62%. This will give enough rotation into corners while maintaining stability throughout the fast corners. With the suspension geometry setup, we should look to prioritise straight line speed. Do this by setting the camber close to maximum and the toe at its absolute lowest value. We don't quite set our camber to its maximum setting because we still want to be able to lean on the tyres a little through the fast, middle and last sectors. When it comes to setting up the suspension, we'll prioritise the sectors of track where you're riding over the curbs. To allow our car to handle the curbs well, we've gone with a 1-4 suspension setup. Then go for a 4-7 anti-roll bar setup to keep the car stable through the fast corners. Finally, set your ride height to 1 and 3 for best efficiency. There are some extremely heavy braking zones around Monza, so we have increased our brake pressure to 100% to slow the car down as quickly as possible. Set your brake bias to 52% to aid with any front lock-in. Monza doesn't work the front tyres overly much, so we can keep the front tyre pressures at 23 to keep heating them. Then lower your rear tyre pressures to 19.9 to help manage the rear tyre wear and traction. Singapore is made up of a lot of 90-degree corners, which are mainly taken at a slow speed. Therefore, you should prioritise your downforce while ensuring your suspension is soft enough to handle the high curbs. Start with a wing setup of 9 and 11. This is the highest wing angle we'll run all season long and is even higher than our Monaco setup. By shaving a couple of points off the front wing, you'll still have enough straight line speed to make an overtake during the race should you need to. To get the best acceleration out of the slow 90-degree corners, set your on-throttle diff to 50%. This will give you good traction and limit wheel spin. Then set your off-throttle diff to 58%. This will help us run lower front wing by rotating the car more when turning into a corner. You'll want to run almost maximum camber and minimum toe around here. This will keep the car on its toes while helping with rear traction under acceleration. As mentioned at the beginning, you should opt for a soft setup, and we've gone to the extreme of running 1 and 5 on the suspension. The softer front will let you ride curbs well, while the average rear will give you a good trade-off between performance and tyre wear. If you do find the rear tyres wearing too much, then you can knock the rear suspension down by 1 or 2 points to preserve your tyre life. Next up, go with a 5-7 anti-roll bar setup. We will want to keep this balanced to give the best performance through the slow and fast corners. Then set your ride height to 2 and 3. We run our brake pressure at 90% around Singapore. There are a lot of braking zones, but if we run any higher pressure, we risk lockups as tyres wear down. And this lower pressure gives you an easier car to drive throughout a long race. Then set your bias to 52%. Finally, we want to lower the tyre pressures to help with cooling and wear throughout the race. Go with 22.6 on the front and 19.9 on the rears. This will help you keep the tyres alive through a long race and should give you the option to run a one-stop strategy, which is definitely the fastest option. Russia features a few fast corners and a couple of long straights, so you'll want to go easy on your aero. Go for 3 at the front and 7 at the rear. The higher than average rear will allow your car to grip through the fast corners without your back end stepping out. Try not to go above 3 on your front wing angle, otherwise you'll be giving up too much speed during the race and you'll find it hard to overtake. Moving on to the transmission, you'll want to keep your on-throttle diff low to allow you to accelerate hard, and having an off-throttle diff set to 65% will allow your car to turn in well during the slower last sector. You won't be leaning on your tyres too much around Sochi, as most corners are short, sharp 90-degree turns, so you should look to run close to maximum camber. Pair this with almost minimum toe to get the best drive down the long straights. Because most corners are fast 90-degree turns, you should be actively looking to minimise your turning angle by running over the curbs, both at the apex and at the exit. To be able to do this, run a soft suspension setup at 2 and 4. We've found that anti-roll bars of 4 and 9 give a really balanced feeling car throughout a lap of Sochi, and that a ride height of 3 and 4 allows you to really attack every curb without worrying about bottoming out. We look to run a familiar combination in our brake setup of 97% pressure and 50% brake bias. We can run a higher pressure than normal to ensure we minimise the distance of every braking zone, and the balanced brake bias will help avoid your wheels from locking. Finally, run your tyre pressures lower than average to help with both traction and tyre wear, although tyre wear isn't too much of an issue around Russia. Go with 22.6 at the front and 20.3 at the rear. We've designed this setup to give you a very drivable and balanced car, and the rear end should stay planted all race long. There are a couple of corners where you'll need to keep the rear end in check, mainly the fast right-hander of turn 9. So let's start with the aero. We've run an aero setup of 4 at the front and 6 at the rear. This will keep the car well balanced while keeping a good amount of speed on the straights. To help with traction and help protect your tyres around this demanding circuit, run your on-throttle diff at 50%, then set your off-throttle diff to 65%. This will give you the best trade-off of stability and minimal understeer. Moving on to the suspension geometry, you'll want to run close to our usual setup of maximum camber and minimal toe, but a little more balanced this time. You'll want a little more camber angle at the front to help you through the sweeping corners. You should look to run a stiffer suspension all round for Suzuka. You'll be flinging the car left and right throughout the lap, so you won't want your car to be sluggish as you do this. Go for a suspension setup of 3 and 6 with an anti-roll bar setup of 7 and 10. This stiffer setup will help maintain speed in your car, especially through the S's and spoon curve. Just be careful when you throw your car into turn 3, as if you keep your throttle planted, you may feel a little rear instability during a race. Go on to set your ride height to 3 and 4. This is a slightly higher ride height than normal, but it just ensures your car isn't too low and stiff. Moving on to your brakes, run 92% pressure and 52% bias. This brake setup feels perfect for this track and you won't have any problems at all with lockups or braking instability. Finally, the tyre pressures need to be low because you'll be leaning on your tyres a lot and they will tend to overheat. We compensate this by running 21.4 or 21.8 on the fronts and the minimum 19.5 on both rears. Around the Circuit of the Americas, you'll want enough front wing angle to avoid you from washing out wide during the first sector and enough to get your car turned in through the slower second half of the lap. However, you want to run it as low as you can get away with due to the very long straight. Run with 4 on your front wing and 7 on your rear. We did try to lower the front wing to 3, but found the first sector S's extremely hard to get the car turned into, so 4 felt best for us. This track has a few slow acceleration zones, and at the start of sector 3, there is a very tricky acceleration zone out of turn 13. To ensure you don't lose your rear end, go for a 50% on-throttle diff, and pair that with a 58% off-throttle diff. This will help with a little extra rotation throughout the lap. Jumping onto the suspension geometry, this is where we set up our car to try and get a little more turn in through sector 1. By lowering our camber a little and increasing our front toe, you'll have a car which is a little more responsive, allowing you to carry speed through the tricky first sector. Go for -2.8, -1.2, 0.07 and 0.2 here. With all of the elevation changes at this track, you'll want to run a soft suspension. Go for 2 and 4 here with an anti-roll bar setup of 4 and 9. If you want a car which is a little more responsive, you can increase your rear suspension a touch. However, the stiffer you go at the rear, the twitchier your car will become, and in turn your rear tyres will start to overheat. Go with 2 and 4 on the ride height. Next up, the brake setup. As with most of our race setups, go for 95% brake pressure and 50% bias. You want to keep the brake bias at 50% as you will be braking and turning at the same time at a few places around the track, so you're much more likely to lock a wheel if you run a higher brake bias. Finally, when your tyre pressure is low, go for 21.8 at the front and 19.5 at the rear. This track is brutal on tyre temperature and wear, so we use our pressures to combat this as much as possible. Because Mexico has 3 distinctly different sectors, any setup is going to be a compromise. We've gone the route of ensuring the rear of the car remains stable, ensuring we can get the power down easily. Implement this approach with a 4-7 wing setup. You can run 1 point lower on both front and rear wings to maximise straight line speed, however you won't be as fast through any of the corners. Set your on-throttle diff to 50% and off-throttle to 62%. This goes to helping you get the best traction out of every corner, which is especially important to get a good run out of the last corner and onto the long pit straight. Next, set your camber to -2.6 and -1.1 and your toe to 0.05 and 0.2. This is the best way to set up your car to ensure it remains stable throughout the whole lap, and this comes in handy through the fast middle sector, ensuring you can keep your foot planted through the S's. The best way to minimise your lap time through the first sector is to ride over the curbs as much as you can get away with. Set up your car to handle these bumps by going for a 1-5 suspension setup. Then go for a 3-9 anti-roll bar setup. Finally, a 2-4 ride height will help maximise your top speed potential. Go on to set your brakes to 95% pressure and 50% bias. This is a common theme throughout a lot of our setups, but that is because it remains one of the quickest and most stable ways to set up your brakes. Finally, when your tyre pressure is low at 21.8 at the front and 19.5 at the rear. This just ensures that you don't run into any temperature issues which can be a problem around this track. It will also help you get the traction down out of the slower corners. Starting with the aero, we run a 3-6 aero setup. You'll find that around most corners of Interlagos, you will start accelerating while still turning, meaning you need to ensure that you have enough rear traction at all times. A rear wing angle of 6 helps your rear end stick to the track, while a front aero of 3 gives you enough front end downforce to get the car turned in. To help with rear traction, we run our on-throttle diff at 50%, then we set our off-throttle diff to 55% to give us a good amount of rotation at slow speed. This will really help through the middle part of the lap and lets us run a low front end aero setup. We've set up our suspension geometry with a little more front camber and front toe. This will help the front of the car be a little more responsive, which should help you get the front end turned in into those medium speed corners. Go for -2.8, -1.1, 0.07 and 0.2. We want to run a primarily soft suspension as there's a fair bit of undulation change throughout a lap of Interlagos, and we also want to avoid the car being too stiff and twitchy. Go with 2 and 4 on the suspension and pair that with 4 and 9 on the anti-roll bars. This will stop the car rolling too much through those prolonged corners. Finally, go the ride height of 3 and 4. Next up, the brakes. Run our usual 95% pressure and 50% brake bias for the best all-round braking performance. This should also help avoid lockups into the first corner. Finally, set your tyres to 21.4 and 21.8 at the front and 19.9 at the rear. This offset setup accounts for the extra stress that your front right tyre will be under throughout the race, and it should help you manage your temperatures better. Deciding on a route to go for this setup is mainly dictated by the 2 extremely long straights in the second sector. We need to ensure that we carry enough speed throughout these sections of track. Start by setting your aero to 3 and 7. Running a low front wing will give us the best straight line speed while giving us just enough bite to get the car turned in through the slower corners. To ensure you have enough traction out of the slow corners and onto the long straights, set your on-throttle diff to 50%. Then go for an off-throttle diff of 65%. This should give you a little extra rotation at slower speeds. We've set up our camber to give us a little more angle on the front compared to the rear. This will help carry a little more speed through the faster corners. Then set your toe to its minimum value to give us a little extra top speed potential. Throughout a lap of Abu Dhabi, you'll find yourself riding over the curbs a lot. This is key to finding speed during the second half of the lap. So opt for a really soft suspension setup. We go with 1 and 4 on the suspension and 4 and 8 on the anti-roll bars. Then we go with 2 and 4 on the ride height. If you find you're struggling over some of the curbs, increase your ride height to 3 and 5. There are some very heavy stops around Abu Dhabi, so go with a brake pressure of 97% and a brake bias of 50%. This balanced brake bias will help avoid any lockups through the fast middle and final sector. Finally, go for tyre pressures of 22.2 at the front and 19.5 at the rear. Rear traction is key around Abu Dhabi, and tyre wear can be an issue, so these lower pressures should really help. And that'll do it for our Abu Dhabi race setup, and for our F1 2020 dry setup series. This setup should give you a nice soft car, allowing you to attack every corner around the season finale. If it helps you out, pop this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more F1 content. I just wanted to close this video by saying a huge thanks to you guys for helping this small channel of ours grow so quickly and hit 3,000 subs. Here's to the next 3,000. As usual, I'll leave this video with a little bit of racing, and until next time, see you on track.
Work. That's a new fastest lap of the race. Approaching the pit window, you'll be on the mediums. We're leading our teammate by 2.9 seconds. Nice work, that brings you up a place.